It always starts the same way. A powerful nation, wealthy, confident, and convinced it's untouchable, quietly drifts into a pattern that has ended every major empire for the last 250 years. France in 1789, Russia in 1917, Britain after World War II. Three very different nations, three different cultures, yet each one fell, following the exact same seven-stage sequence, a domino effect they couldn't escape once the first piece tipped. And the terrifying part, in 2025, the United States isn't just following that pattern, it's matching it, step for step, almost as if reading from a script written by history itself. Every stage they crossed, we crossed. Every decision they made, we're making. And now, right this moment, America has entered the same stage that triggered their collapse. Stage 5, the point where systems begin to fracture in plain sight, where the cracks are no longer hiding beneath the surface, and where the fall of a currency becomes irreversible. If this pattern continues, the next stages aren't speculation, they're déjà vu. When historians look back at collapsing empires, they don't see chaos or randomness, they see structure, a predictable seven-stage pattern that appears over and over again, no matter the country, no matter the century. First comes wealth concentration, where prosperity piles up at the top until the foundation below begins to thin and crack. Then political breakdown, leaders turning on each other, institutions paralyzing themselves, and governments losing the ability to act. After that comes currency overprinting, the moment nations run out of solutions and start creating money faster than they can create value. Stage 4 is public distrust, when citizens stop believing the numbers, the leaders, and eventually the money itself. Stage 5 is the breaking point, where institutions, markets, and government stability begin to fracture at the same time. Stage 6 is the economic contraction that follows: shrinking trade, collapsing confidence, layoffs, bankruptcies, and the slow suffocation of an economy that once felt unstoppable. And Stage 7 is the reboot, the moment every collapsing nation is eventually forced into a new currency, a new monetary structure, and a new economic order. France hit every one of these stages between 1787 and 1793. Russia followed the same path between 1914 and 1917. Britain repeated it from 1945 to 1971. The same pattern, the same order, the same symptoms, the same outcome: collapse, followed by a reset. And for the first time in modern U.S. history, America is not just entering this pattern, it's aligning with it perfectly, step for step, stage by stage. America's path into the pattern didn't begin this year, or even this decade. It started more than half a century ago, when, in 1971, the US dollar was cut loose from gold, allowing money to be created without a physical anchor. That decision quietly opened the door to long-term inflation, expanding debt, and an economy increasingly dependent on printed dollars rather than real productivity. Decade by decade, the country drifted deeper into the cycle. But the warning signs became impossible to ignore after 2008, when the financial crisis forced the Federal Reserve to inject trillions into the system. That was the true beginning of Stage 3, currency expansion not as a tool, but as a necessity. By 2019, the cracks were already showing: slowing growth, rising debt, and a fragile banking system. Then the 2020 to 2021 money printing wave hit with the force of a financial earthquake. Over $7 trillion was created in a span so short No empire in history had ever attempted something similar. Prices soared, supply chains buckled, and trust began to erode. Stage 4 had arrived, public confidence collapsing as the cost of living exploded while wages stood still. But the real shift came in 2023 and 2024. Banks failed, interest rates spiked, countries around the world began reducing their dependence on the US dollar. Government spending broke every historical record, even during so-called peaceful years. And by 2025, the signs were undeniable. America had stepped into stage 5, the same stage every collapsing empire entered right before the fall accelerated. Not because the country is weak, but because the pattern is stronger than the nation following it. Every empire begins its decline long before people realize anything is wrong. It starts quietly, almost invisibly, inside the numbers, inside who controls the wealth, who controls the opportunities, and who controls the future. In every historical collapse, this was stage 1. France before 1789 looked prosperous from the outside, but beneath the surface, nearly all economic power was concentrated among a tiny circle of nobles and financiers. Russia before 1917 was the same, a vast empire where the land, the factories, and the banking systems were controlled by elites living in a completely different reality from the people they ruled. Even Britain, right before the pound collapsed after World War II, had wealth consolidated in a shrinking number of hands, while the working class struggled under rising costs and stagnant wages. America today mirrors that pattern with eerie accuracy. The top 1% now controls more wealth than the entire middle class combined. A handful of corporations dominate the country's food supply, its media, its banking system, and its digital infrastructure. Each crisis widens the gap. The wealthy get richer through asset inflation, while the average American falls further behind. Homes have become investment vehicles instead of places to live. Education, healthcare, and basic necessities climb faster than paychecks. The pressure feels invisible until suddenly it's not. This stage always feels stable while it's happening. In fact, it often feels like progress. Stock markets rise, corporate profits balloon, and everyone is told the system is stronger than ever. But beneath the surface, tension is building. Because every empire that reached this level of concentration entered the exact same next phase, political breakdown. Not because people were angry at each other, but because the system stopped serving most of the population. That invisible shift from shared prosperity to concentrated power is the first domino. And for America, that domino has already fallen. Once wealth concentrates at the top, politics begins to fracture. This isn't emotion or opinion, it's a mathematical certainty. When the majority feels disconnected from the system itself begins to tear apart. France reached this stage in the late 1780s when the Estates General collapsed under infighting. The government couldn't agree on taxation, spending, reforms, or even basic governance. Russia fell into the same trap before 1917, when the Duma became paralyzed. Ministers were replaced every few weeks, and political factions fought harder against each other than they did against the nation's problems. In Britain, after World War II, parties were constantly deadlocked. Governments fell one after another, and leaders spent more time arguing than rebuilding the collapsing pound. America today is experiencing the same political breakdown, almost line for line. Congress has become a battlefield where nothing significant gets done unless it's passed through emergency measures or last-minute bailouts. Government shutdowns have gone from rare crises to predictable annual events. Every election, regardless of who wins, is met with accusations, investigations, recounts, and distrust. Half the population believes the other half is trying to destroy the country. Policies swing so violently every 4 years that long-term planning becomes impossible. And the institutions designed to keep the country stable, the courts, the agencies, the regulators, are increasingly viewed through a partisan lens rather than as unified national pillars. Stage 2 is always the point where nations begin to lose the ability to solve problems. Not because the problems are too big, but because leaders stop working together. In history, this stage ends with governments choosing short-term fixes over long-term solutions. And almost every time, the first quick fix they reach for is money printing. That's how the pattern advances. Paralysis in politics leads directly to inflation in the economy. And America crossed that threshold years ago. When governments lose the ability to fix problems through policy, they turn to the one tool that requires no cooperation, no negotiation, and no legislative agreement: the printing press. Every collapsing empire reached this exact moment. France, desperate to cover its debts and calm political chaos, printed the assignat, a currency that was supposed to be temporary. It became permanent, then excessive, then worthless. Russia printed the Tsarist ruble into oblivion during the final years before the revolution, flooding the economy with paper money that bought less every month. Britain, drowning in post-war costs, expanded the money supply so aggressively that the pound collapsed on the global stage and lost its position as the world's reserve currency. America entered this stage in 2008, but the real acceleration began in 2020 when crisis struck. The Federal Reserve didn't just print money, it rewired the entire financial system. $7 trillion were created in less than 2 years, a volume so massive it shattered every historical precedent. It was a bandage applied over a wound that reached the bone. Asset prices exploded, investors cheered, and for a moment it looked like the printing had worked. But inflation was quietly building underneath. Housing detached from reality. Groceries rose month after month. The cost of living drifted so far from wages that millions of Americans lost purchasing power even while earning more on paper. This is the exact moment where trust begins to slip, not all at once, but gradually, as people start to realize the numbers no longer reflect reality. When money loses meaning, the economy loses stability. When printing becomes a habit, collapse becomes a consequence. And the U.S. didn't slow down. It printed more in 3 years than it did in the first 2 centuries of its existence combined. That's the hallmark of Stage 3, the point of no return, where money creation replaces real economic growth. And once a nation passes this threshold, the next stage is unavoidable. The public begins to lose faith, not just in the currency, but in the system behind it. Stage 4 is where the collapse stops being invisible. This is the moment when ordinary people, not economists, not analysts, not politicians, begin to feel that something is fundamentally wrong. In France, distrust erupted when peasants realized prices were rising faster than wages, and merchants started refusing the government's printed money. In Russia, people hoarded food, gold, and anything tangible because the ruble lost value so quickly it was cheaper to buy today than tomorrow. In Britain, savers began withdrawing money from banks, fearing that the pound they deposited was worth far more than the pound they would eventually get back. The United States crossed into this stage unmistakably over the past few years. When banks like Silicon Valley Bank and Signature collapsed in 2023, it wasn't just a financial event, it was a psychological shock. People saw tech companies unable to withdraw money. They saw regulators scrambling. They saw the government rushing to guarantee deposits that were never supposed to need saving. Even those who didn't fully understand the crisis felt something deeper. The system was not as secure as they had believed. Across the country, households pulled savings from banks, moved money into gold, crypto, and money market funds, and began questioning whether the dollar could hold value long term. The cost of living delivered the second blow to trust. People were told inflation was transitory, yet groceries, rent, gas, and basic necessities kept rising long after officials claimed everything was stabilizing. Families noticed that raises didn't matter because prices simply rose faster. For millions, it felt like falling behind even while working harder than ever. Confidence in the official numbers, inflation, unemployment, growth began to erode. People saw one reality on the news and a completely different reality at the checkout counter. Stage 4 is the psychological tipping point. This is when citizens no longer believe the people in charge, and once that trust breaks, it rarely returns. It happened in France, Russia, and Britain, and the US has now crossed the same line. When the public no longer trusts the currency or the institutions defending it, the collapse moves from a theoretical risk to an active process. And that brings us to the most dangerous stage of all, the one America entered in 2025. Stage 5 is the point every empire fears, because it's where collapse stops being theoretical and starts becoming structural. This is the moment in history when institutions, the systems meant to protect stability, begin to crack under their own weight. France hit this stage when its military refused orders, when regional governments stopped cooperating with the central authority, and when tax collectors couldn't enforce the law without armed escorts. Russia reached it when railroad systems broke down, workers went on strike, and the government could no longer manage food distribution. Britain entered stage 5 when its banks imposed withdrawal limits, inflation outpaced wage controls, and the pound lost international confidence faster than the government could respond. America has now stepped into the same territory. It didn't happen with a single event, but with a chain of fractures that grew louder each year. Banks failed in 2023, revealing vulnerabilities that officials insisted didn't exist. Corporate bankruptcies surged to levels not seen since the 2008 crisis. Major retailers, tech companies, and manufacturers began announcing layoffs, signaling that the foundation of the economy was weaker than the stock market suggested. Government spending spiraled so far out of control that interest payments on the national debt became one of the largest expenses in the entire federal budget, a sign no strong empire has ever reached without consequences. International trust in the dollar also began to erode. Countries accelerated their move away from U.S. treasuries. Trade partners built alternative payment systems. Even long-standing allies questioned whether the American financial system was as invincible as once believed. For the first time, the United States watched the world step back from the currency that had dominated global trade for nearly 8 decades. And then came the Fed dilemma, the clearest indicator of stage 5. If the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, businesses fail, debt becomes unpayable, and the economy contracts. If it cuts rates, inflation returns stronger, the dollar weakens, and foreign confidence collapses. For decades, the Fed had options. Now, every path leads to damage. That S, the hallmark of Stage 5, when the institutions designed to maintain stability are forced to choose between two outcomes that both accelerate decline. This is the point where history accelerates. Stage 5 isn't a prediction or a warning, it's a confirmation. It means the empire has reached the point where systems can no longer hide the internal weaknesses. It means the collapse is no longer a future possibility. It has begun its descent. And every empire that ever reached this stage entered the next one immediately after. Economic contraction. Stage 6 is where the consequences that once felt distant suddenly become unavoidable. This is the moment every collapsing empire faced, when the economic engine that powered its rise finally slowed, sputtered, and began to reverse. In France, food prices surged beyond what citizens could afford. Factories closed, trade collapsed, and unemployment spread like wildfire. In Russia, the ruble fell so fast that wages became meaningless. Factories shut down, and shortages turned daily life into survival. Britain's contraction came through rationing, austerity, and the steady weakening of the pound, which forced the country to surrender global dominance and rebuild from a weakened position. America now stands on the threshold of this same contraction, and signs are everywhere. Corporate bankruptcies have spiked to levels not seen since the darkest days of 2009. Regional banks remain unstable, quietly holding billions in unrealized losses from bonds they can't sell without collapsing their balance sheets. Borrowing has become more expensive for businesses and households, squeezing spending and slowing growth. Job cuts are rising across sectors that were once considered untouchable: technology, finance, retail, logistics, signaling that employers no longer trust the future enough to maintain their workforce. The housing market, once the symbol of American security, now sits on a knife edge. Prices are historically high, yet affordability is at its lowest point in decades. If the economy weakens further, values could fall sharply. But if interest rates drop too quickly, prices could surge again, adding new instability to an already fragile market. The dollar's global position is also beginning to shift. Countries trading in local currencies instead of dollars, global reserves slowly diversifying, and international confidence quietly thinning. These changes don't destroy a currency overnight. They weaken it one layer at a time, until one day the system can no longer support its own weight. Economic contraction is the moment when the pain becomes visible to everyone. It's when people feel their money shrinking, their opportunities narrowing, and their future becoming uncertain. Stage 6 doesn't end an empire, but it delivers the blow that makes the end inevitable. And once a nation reaches this point, history shows there is only one destination left: the monetary reboot. Stage 7 is the point where every collapsing empire arrives, when all other options are exhausted. It is not a choice, it is a requirement. France reached this moment when the assignat became worthless, forcing the government to scrap the currency entirely and introduce a new monetary system just to keep the nation functioning. Russia went through the same process after the revolution, replacing the destroyed Tsarist ruble with a new Soviet currency in an attempt to restore order. Britain entered its reboot when the pound could no longer maintain global confidence, eventually surrendering its reserve currency status and reshaping its economic identity under a new system. America now stands closer to this stage than most people realize. The national debt has grown so large that paying interest alone consumes a staggering portion of the federal budget. The dollar's global dominance, once unquestionable, is quietly weakening as more countries diversify their reserves and build parallel trade networks. Inflation has permanently altered the cost of living, reshaping what money is worth and how far it can stretch. These are not temporary problems. They are structural fractures that cannot be fixed with short-term policies or political promises. When a nation enters Stage 7, the reset takes one of several forms. The most likely, in America's case, is a transition toward a central bank digital currency, a system where money can be reprogrammed, tracked, and controlled in ways the current dollar cannot. Another possibility is a controlled devaluation of the dollar to reduce the real burden of the national debt. Some speculate about a partial return to a commodity-backed system, where a portion of the currency is tied to gold or other tangible assets. Others expect a complete redesign of the monetary framework, similar to what happened after World War II with the Bretton Woods Agreement. No empire in history has escaped this stage. The reset always arrives, no matter how powerful the nation once was. And as America moves deeper into institutional fracture and economic contraction, the timeline toward a monetary reboot draws closer. The only question left is not if the system changes, but how, and whether the transition will be managed, chaotic, or forced by crisis. Stage 7 is the moment an old financial order dies, so a new one can replace it. And for the United States, that moment is approaching faster than most people are prepared to admit. America didn't stumble into this pattern by accident. It followed it, step by step, decade by decade, repeating the same decisions, same mistakes, and same warnings that every collapsing empire ignored before it fell. Stage 1 concentrated the wealth. Stage 2 fractured the politics. Stage 3 unleashed unprecedented money printing. Stage 4 destroyed public trust. Stage 5, where we are right now, cracked the institutions from the inside. And Stage 6, the contraction, already unfolding, is pushing the nation toward the final point in the cycle. The monetary reset that ends one era and begins another. The signs aren't subtle anymore. They're everywhere, in rising prices that never truly fall back, in unstable banks scrambling to survive, in debt levels that would have been unthinkable a generation ago, and in the world slowly stepping away from the dollar it once depended on. This isn't fear-mongering, it's pattern recognition. The same 7-stage sequence has toppled 3 major powers in 250 years, and the United States is now deep inside the same script. The only question left is whether America becomes the first to break the pattern, or the fourth to fall exactly as history predicts. If you want to understand each stage in depth, what triggers them, how fast they unfold, and how they impact ordinary people, make sure you subscribe. We're breaking down every stage, every signal, and every shift that the mainstream refuses to talk about. Because once you understand the pattern, you never look at the news the same way again. The collapse isn't coming someday. It's already in motion. And the world that emerges on the other side will not look anything like the one we grew up in.